Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chatham House. I'm Robin Niblett, the director of the Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this dialogue on the UK's future defence choices. I'd also like to welcome our members who are watching via the web. And just to let you know, there will be a transcript of this meeting available later, so I suppose self-evidently this meeting is on the record. And could I please make sure that you will have your phones off and not on buzz. So I don't know if I actually checked with my three speakers earlier today, but hopefully they haven't got them on the beepers or pagers, so we're not interrupted as we go forward. This dialogue, in a way, follows on to the meeting that we had with the Foreign Secretary and the two shadow Foreign Secretaries earlier this month, and it forms part of our project on Britain's future and international ambitions and choices. I think I've mentioned and referred to this project in the past. As we are approaching, obviously we're approaching the election, even though we don't know formally the date yet, we thought it'd be interesting to divide this discussion into two halves. For me to take an opportunity maybe to ask some questions that are that little bit more strategic in nature, perhaps, although you, the audience, will be the judge of whether strategic or not later on. And then after about 30-35 minutes, I'm going to turn over to Sarah Montague, who will punch in on maybe some slightly more nearer-term questions and also engage you, the audience, in our discussion from that point onwards. So I'm delighted that Sarah from the BBC Radio 4's Today programme could join us for that portion of the programme. The speakers themselves, I think, require no introduction, and I'm not going to maybe use up valuable time in that sense, going through their, in each case, very successful and important political careers, certainly in the context of the discussion we're having today. But I wanted to get straight in with, I suppose, one of those big questions that's certainly of interest to us in the context of the project, and I'm sure very important in terms of the kinds of choices and political decisions you'll be taking. Bob, I'm going to turn to you first, as Secretary of State, currently for Defence. How do we place the type of conflict that we think Britain should be preparing for in the future? Inevitably, Afghanistan today is taking up the bulk, certainly, of our political military focus and attention, taking up a huge amount of resources. Obviously, it's taken lives, effort, as people say, blood and treasury from the United Kingdom. But is this the model of the future? Are we preparing effectively for the kinds of conflicts that might be out there? We have risks from Iran. We have a very deeply changing geopolitical position with the rise of China. We saw the sinking of the South Korean boat just a few days ago. How, as a Secretary of State for Defence, do you prepare for the existence of these very intense insurgency-type conflicts with simultaneously the potential risk of major conflict in the future? And where should Britain be putting its effort today?
We've got to put our effort today into Afghanistan. It's the main effort. It has to be the main effort. We've got 9,500 people deployed there. They're entitled to our complete focus with that regard. But when we come to planning for the future and the potential threats that we will face, if we plan on the basis that some future conflict is going to be Afghanistan again, or even similar to Afghanistan, we will be in error, and in very serious error. If there's one thing that history teaches us, and that is that we cannot predict threats. And we try to bring out some of these issues in the Green Paper that we did, and so therefore planning for the various threats that we could face in the future, having to do that in what may be a resource-constraint situation means that we've got to try to build the absolute maximum amount of adaptability into our force structure that we can.
And when you look at Asia, I know that, as you said, you mentioned the new Green Paper did talk right at the beginning about the changing balance of power in Asia as potentially being one of the most fundamental and dynamic changes for the future of British defence. Does Britain have a perspective, and even today the capabilities, to be able to respond to some type of change in the situation there, whether it be in terms of maritime an effect on supply routes that bring energy and supply there. If the United States were to find itself embroiled in some situation around Taiwan, I mean, do we have the capacities today, militarily, in terms of our naval capacities and so on, to be able to think about that type of crisis at the same time as we're so focused on Afghanistan?
We have to be prepared to work with others in order to do that. Look, we are, of any nation on earth, one of, in this, interdependent world in which we live, we are one of the most exposed to the global environment. That brings great benefits to us. It also brings great risks to us. So we therefore, yes, there are some things that we have to plan to be able to do on our own, and we always will have to, like extensive threats to our own nation and to our overseas dependencies. But we have to be prepared and we have to plan to be able to work with others to maintain the world security environment, to maintain free passage of goods, on the ice seas and in other environments as well. And there are new threats that we've got to look at. We're increasingly dependent upon space. We've seen the kind of threat that can come from the cyber environment. We use those, and we are dependent upon those domains for our own capability, and so we've got to make absolutely certain that we've planned to be able to defend that capability, against others. And yes, in some circumstances, be able to project force in those environments as well.
Liam, if I could turn to you now. I mean, a similar question, or the same question, I'd be interested to hear your viewpoint of the future of conflict, how you see this balance between the likelihood of counterinsurgency perhaps being the pattern of the future, and also whether you believe that from a political and a public level, people would want to be engaged as much in this type of conflict in the future, given the experiences we've had over the last 7 or 8 years. What's your view of the biggest list of risks that you think from a defence standpoint but needs to be thinking about in the future?
Well, I'm not sure the public ever want to be involved in any conflict. The point is that sometimes it's unavoidable. And I think you need to begin with the wider environment. We live in a genuinely globalised economy. That means that our interests are more widely spread and more susceptible to more actors in other places than they may have been in the past. And I think that politicians have been quite slow to grasp the realities of globalization and the threats that they bring. They like to talk about prosperity and trade and so on, but they tend to shy away from the unavoidable importation of strategic risk that globalization brings. And I think that has to be the starting point. The question is, what will wars of the future look like? The only honest answer is, don't know. And therefore, we have to maintain generic capability that is adaptable to as many potentially identifiable future threats as possible. And therefore, we do not make the mistake of saying future wars will be like the current war, and therefore you invest in the type of capabilities we'd require for the current war. The pattern is changing as we look at it. People say, we'll never have state-on-state warfare again involving the United Kingdom. Well, perhaps we will not in a primary sense, but that doesn't mean we wouldn't be dragged into someone else's state-on-state warfare. People say that it's going to be asymmetrical rather than state-on-state. Well, you look at Georgia, and the state-on-state attack was preceded by an asymmetric attack. And I think that what you're looking at is the concept of hybridity in the threats that we face in the future, and that's going to require us to have a very different mindset. The other thing I would say is that we come from a history where our defence programmes tend to be about, let's review the number of ships we have, and let's look at our aircraft, and let's see how many tanks we have. And the threats in the world out there at the moment are not just about the size of conventional capabilities lined up against us. They're also about the technologies which might deny us access to our own conventional capabilities, and the necessity of investing in things that perhaps our people cannot see but are otherwise indispensable to the security is going to be one of the great political challenges in the years ahead.
Nick, turning to you again on this same question in terms of prioritization, some of the major threats that you see emerging here, I think both comments that we've heard so far have stressed the fact and the need for agility, for differentiation, the ability to stop and change. But I think this idea that in a globalized world we may find that we have to project force quite significantly in the future will be important.
Yes, I think one of the fundamental questions the Strategic Defence Review will have to wrestle with is where on this spectrum of activity between the sort of war we're currently fighting in Afghanistan and the contingency of possible state-on-state warfare in the future, we think we want to strike the balance. And the one thing we can say with absolute confidence is that whatever conclusion is arrived at, whatever assumptions are made, they will turn out to be wrong. So we've got to do our best at thinking what the character of future conflict will be about. We know, in a sense, that the nature of conflict is unchanging because, in a sense, it's endemic to human nature. But the wars that may be fought in the 21st century will be about increasingly desperate competition for natural resources, oil and water, fertile lands. Perhaps we'll suddenly see forced mass migration of peoples as a consequence of climate change. And so I think that the reasonable assumption to make is that we want very versatile, very nimble troops who can get in and out of situations very easily, and that this is going to require some rebalancing of our forces to those who we think will have the most relevance to that sort of activity in the future. And we can make some reasonable assumptions about what we think they'll need. We know that all that sort of activity will require helicopters. We know there will be a requirement for versatile vehicles that are capable of manoeuvring in different sort of domains, but with adequate protection. And I think even when we look at our future naval requirements, again, the watchwords should be versatility, adaptability, and not getting ourselves too firmly rooted into old-fashioned models of what a navy ought to look like. If there is a possibility in the future that the threat you refer to, that perhaps China might come to pose, if that does come to pass, there's nothing really, in all honesty, that the United Kingdom is going to be able to do on its own. We will have to work very closely with allies, principally through NATO, but other countries around the world as well. And that needs to be an absolutely central element of our thinking. How best we can project force in alliance with other countries, and what bit of that collective projection of force we are best equipped to do and should retain some specialism in, and what we're prepared to depend on others to do for us.
I have a problem with that, with something that Nick said about the assumptions, because I do not think we can come to the assumption that it's scarcity of resources from whatever reason that is necessarily going to lead us to conflict, because there is also competition of ideologies. One of the problems we face today with transnational terrorism, particularly violent Islamist terrorism, is an ideological threat. And we've got to, in a society that values tolerance, remember the threat that fanaticism can pose to us. And this information asymmetry, which also exists, is something we have to get back to. We didn't just win the Cold War because we won the military threats. We also won the ideological battle. And when people say the Cold War ended, the Cold War didn't end. The Cold War was won. And it was won as much by our ideological and political commitment as it was by our economic and military capabilities. So I just think that it's something that we need to bear in mind, that looking at physical causes will not always give us the answer. We have also ideological clashes that we need to bear in mind in terms of global security.
Turning to this issue of ideological clashes, and as you mentioned, the Cold War, I wanted to get to the heart of NATO, the future of the Atlantic Alliance. As you all know, we're in the midst of a review of NATO's strategic concept. The Atlantic Alliance was a powerful alliance when it understood the ideological competition that it was involved in facing down from communism and the Soviet Union. It has now been trying to adapt itself pretty much for the last 20 years to new missions. It strikes me at least that this new NATO strategic concept is pointing out perhaps a difference in perspective between a United States that retains very much a global perspective on its security and a European set of members, many of whom have a far more regional or closer to their shores kind of perspective on their security. Less to do with ideology, therefore less to do with unification around one ideological aim, perhaps a more utilitarian approach. And I'm wondering, Bob, again starting with you on this point, whether you see the NATO being able to survive this period. Will it be with us in 5 to 10 years' time, 20 years' time? Should the UK be relying upon this Atlantic alliance being as strong as it is in the future to be able to project British security needs?
There are those tensions in the NATO alliance, and squaring off some of the views of those nations, particularly as you go towards the east, to see Article 5 and self-protection as being the overwhelming priority, with those of us who see NATO's ability to deploy force and to respond to new threats as being essential to NATO's relevance in the future. And those are the issues that are going to have to be dealt with in the new strategic concept that we are going to have to tackle in the next year or so. But I would just say, I mean, in response to one thing that Nick said about China and Britain not being able to respond on its own, I mean, he's absolutely right at one level, but we are already responding to those kind of situations in many ways. We're responding by being part of a global security structure that we have to be able to support, that we have to be able to try to enhance. And we can only do that if we're genuine players. It's no good us being members of the United Nations unless we bring something to the table. It's no good us being members of NATO unless we have influence within NATO. So we have to have those influences. And I would say, and this is where Liam would probably disagree with me, that we have to have influence in Europe as well. Europe is not seen as being, a major player by many people in terms of security. But, marrying, European influence and the capability that the European Union can bring to bear in conflict situations with the capability of NATO and making them complementary to each other, I think is very, very important to our security.
Liam, turning to you then on the future of NATO. You spoke here at Chatham House a while ago on this particular issue, right down to the question of resources and how they're shared or not shared between particular member states. But this balance between where NATO is going to go, whether it can actually reflect the interests of all of its members and still be cohesive, alongside whether the UK perhaps should be putting more effort into the European Union in its defence space, which after all at least does have more of a regional perspective to its security needs.
Well, to go back to my initial point about globalisation, we're a member of P5, G8, G20, NATO, Commonwealth, European Union. We have a very wide range of international global interests. We have to recognise that each one of them provides a lever that can be used to enhance our national security, and we're going to have to do that. Very simple facts like 92% of Britain's trade comes by sea comes as a surprise to a lot of people, and yet it tells you a great deal about what we will have to do to protect our trade, our energy security, and so on in the future. NATO has to be the cornerstone of that. But there are a number of basic problems in Europe. One is that too many of our NATO allies, as I said here, simply will not fund what are their NATO obligations. Too many of them don't wish to deploy in support of their NATO obligations when required to do so. Too many of the European members, and this is particularly true in the European Union's aspect, they say, well, we really see our future as being peacekeepers, which is all very well, except you can only keep the peace if there's a peace to keep. And sometimes you have to fight for peace, and sometimes you have to die for peace. That's our history. And so we have to be willing to maintain as the cornerstone of our defence an alliance that is willing to fight. And I would say, what does NATO have to do? I would look at it on a functional basis. Well, NATO's got to maintain an international maritime capability. It requires land-based expeditionary capability, the defence of continental Europe. And increasingly, it's got a role in what I would call the North, the Baltic, the Barents, the Arctic. And, of course, NATO is essential not just for holding in the United States, but holding in Canada. And I think Canada is too often forgotten as a major strategic partner. It's a major power up in the Arctic, where we've got renewed tensions over oil and gas with Russia. It's going to be an international energy power in the years ahead. So I think we should think more about North America and not just the United States in that broader global view. But I sometimes think that the undermining problem that European politicians have is that they all have maps of the world with the Greenwich Meridian in the middle. And if you go to the United States, they have maps of the world with the Pacific in the middle. And in many ways, that's actually a more contemporary geopolitical map than this Eurocentric view, which I think reinforces a view that you can be parochial rather than global in your outlook.
But is there a risk that perhaps we have a United States that has a global outlook, a UK that has a relatively global outlook, but very few other European states that do? Surely the Atlantic Alliance itself won't be able to survive that kind of differentiation.
Well, that's a mission, isn't it? That's a mission for us to spread that outlook rather than an eternal retrenchment. Into what? Britain and France and the United States. That's not an acceptable global application of power. We need to be pushing our case with those smaller European countries. As Bob says, however, giving them a guarantee that Article 5 is meaningful for them and bringing them into a wider global view of our security.
Nick, I mean, obviously, the Liberal Democrats are often painted as having a very pro-European position. You do on many issues, but on defence in particular, I'm interested to hear your viewpoints about this balance between the value that the European Union can bring, given that there are such differentiated priorities amongst its member states. And as Secretary Bob Gates said just the other day, very few of them, I think only 4, are spending above 2% of GDP right now on defence. I mean, how credible can the EU be, even in the civil military space, with such a kind of lack of investment interest?
You asked the question, would NATO still exist in 5 or 10 years' time? I'm absolutely certain that it will, and that it will remain our most critical strategic partnership. And I think that those who envisage this new strategic context taking a narrower view of what NATO should do are completely wrong. It's absolutely essential that this global perspective is sustained. But in terms of the countries of Europe, we can't expect the NATO alliance and the Americans to do as much for us in the next 50 or 60 years as they have in the last 50 or 60 years, for the very reason that Liam put his finger on when he made the point that the Americans are now very much more oriented towards the Pacific than they are to the Atlantic. And the people of Europe are greater in number. We are more populous than the USA. We've got a larger economy than the USA. And we can't expect the Americans to keep doing so much of the heavy lifting on our behalf. The countries of Europe have got to step up to the plate and do more on their own behalf. I don't think we get from where we are now to where we need to be solely through the apparatus of the European Union, although I think that's got a useful part to play. I think it will, in the first instance, be the British, the French, and hopefully a half a dozen other players who do have the same outward view that we do. And in the fullness of time, I agree with Liam, we've got to try and persuade the rest of them to follow that lead. But if we wait for it to happen through the vehicle of ESDP, we're not going to get where we need to get quickly enough, and therefore it will be down to a central core of European countries to set the pace on this in a way that I think the Lisbon Treaty has provided for and accepts as a reasonable way of progressing the European defence space.
Do you see the ESDP, the way it's evolving, is evolving in a relatively positive way? I mean, I think Nick was trying to be pragmatic, at least talking about a core of maybe 6 or 7 countries, perhaps providing a lead to others. But is there an infrastructure of decision-making there, do you think, is going to pull things together?
Do I see a role for the European Union in defence? I see the European Union having a role where NATO cannot or will not do things. But I see it as being additional, therefore, to NATO. My big worry is that the countries that are unwilling to spend or deploy in support of their NATO commitments that they've already made are very unlikely to want to increase either their spending or their deployment to additionally support the European Union. And what I worry about is you get duplication rather than additionality. Maybe I'll be proved wrong. Maybe we'll get a rush for spending on defence from some Central European countries, but I fear I'm going to be disappointed.
Don't hold your breath.
But
what's your experience on this? Yeah.
But we're not going to be able to get the maximum leverage in Europe purely on a bilateral basis, and there are occasions where we can get European countries to step up to the plate. I think the most recent of those is Operation Atalanta, where we managed to get, through the European Union, deployable naval capability to a very real issue that we otherwise wouldn't have got, and some of it is additional to that was being provided by NATO. So you've got to be prepared to act
multilaterally. The assets are not additional.
Well, some of them were, and there's some of them that were not there, and people would not have been prepared to deploy under another flag in the way that they were under the European Union. So you've got to try, yes, to avoid duplication. And I think that would be a disaster at a time when, people are absolutely right. It's difficult to get some European countries to spend at a level of defence that we believe is necessary. So duplication is something that we've got to try to avoid. But the idea that we're going to be able to get all of the cooperation that we need solely through bilateral relations, I think, is wrong.
But that's not put words into my mouth there. What I said was there are a number of different levers that we need to use. We have bilateral. We have some element in the European Union. We have a bigger element in NATO. We have to use a whole range of different tools to deal with the different scenarios that can exist in a globalized economy. We are trying to deal with the threats of the contemporary world, with political structures largely designed for the post-World War II environment and military structures largely designed for the bipolarity of the Cold War. We have got to break away from that mindset. In many ways, we're in much more a sort of great game, 19th century power shape in the world, and we're going to have to relearn not only the use of military power, but soft power and the skills that I think perhaps we lost in that second half of the 20th century in what now looks like the luxury of the Cold War. We're going to have to get them back if we're going to actually be able to use all the influences we should be using as a country and in partnership with those who think the same way as we do.
Let me turn to a different issue right now, which is nuclear weapons. This is a period, obviously, we're basking in the positive aura of the START agreement between Russia and the United States. We have the NPT review conference coming up in a couple of months' time, a nuclear summit under President Obama's leadership in a few weeks' time. But as we look to the future, nuclear proliferation could become a reality, either as a result of where Iran steps, other countries wanting to take in this direction. I'd like to hear your views on the importance of Britain's nuclear deterrent within the context of a world that may see nuclear proliferation, your judgment on this, but also your views on missile defence. Is missile defence ultimately something that is going to be vitally important to Britain's future security in a proliferating world? Where does one invest resources? Hugely expensive to be able to move forward with nuclear modernisation. Missile defence is a topic that's being widely discussed within the context of NATO's strategic concept. Your sense of nuclear weapons, what's most important from a British perspective to play its role in this area? Bob, starting with you.
I think we first of all ought to recognise that the efforts that have been made at countering proliferation have been more successful than most people thought that they would be a few years ago. If you went back 20, 30 years, I don't think there were that many people who would think that we were limited to the numbers of nuclear weapon states that we have now. But there are risks and there are tensions, and the biggest single one, I think, is Iran. Of course, there's North Korea as well. But the consequences of Iran gaining their nuclear capability will not be confined to Iran. Other Middle Eastern countries will feel that they have to respond. And they will respond, and we will wind up with a nuclear-armed Middle East to a greater or a lesser extent. So we have to persuade, Iran not to go down that path, and it's a very big issue for us to deal with. Of course, in a proliferated world, nuclear defence may well become increasingly, important. But let's not give up on counter-proliferation. And we in the P5 have to make our response as well, because we have to be credible, in our own response to non-proliferation. We have tried to do that. We have made unilateral reductions in the United Kingdom that haven't led to reciprocal reductions elsewhere, but we have to be prepared to engage with others, and the P5 themselves have to be prepared to pick up their own responsibility to reduce and potentially eliminate nuclear weapons in the future.
Stretching out Trident, part of the answer to send the right signal in the context of NPT reviews?
Well, remember, we are continuing with this project at a lower warhead level than we had, so we are both within the letter and the spirit of the NPT. And I think it's essential that when countries like Iran are trying to develop the threat, that we do not leave the United Kingdom vulnerable to nuclear blackmail. And if you wait long enough, everything comes round in a circle. I came into politics because I was fundamentally opposed to CND and the unilateralists then, and I'm equally opposed to them now. I believe in multilateral disarmament. I think the START process shows that that's the only real way forward. People say, of course, it's much too expensive. The capital costs at 20-odd billion we can't afford, but we're willing to spend 12 billion on the Olympics for 3 weeks, as opposed to 35 years of protection against nuclear blackmail. I think you pay your money and you make your choices on your priorities. But I absolutely agree with Bob on this point, that Iran is the biggest single emerging threat that we face. And yet it's so little on the political radar. And I think that it's a very binary question. You're either going to allow Iran to become a nuclear weapon state, or you're not going to allow Iran to become a nuclear weapon state. And I would say to those who are watching this debate, there are 3 reasons why we shouldn't allow it. Number one, the nature of the regime. Leaving aside the human rights record, the suppression, the brutal suppression of their own democratic movement, in Iran you have an increasingly militarized state with a hardline theocrat at the top. I can't think of anywhere else where that threat is replicated. Number two, this is a state where par excellence they're willing to export terror and instability as part of their foreign policy. I would not like to see fissile material added to that particular mix. And thirdly, if Iran becomes a nuclear weapon state, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Egypt will follow. And we were talking about the end of the Cold War. It's 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we congratulated ourselves at how we stopped nuclear proliferation at that point. And surely we want something better to leave the next generation than a nuclear arms race in the world's most unstable region, which will be the unavoidable consequence of Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state.
Given the level of seriousness you just described there, and that list of 3 topics, which almost make this an existential threat, the implication is therefore Britain should join the United States or anyone else in taking military action to prevent them from doing it if we can't stop them otherwise?
We begin the process as we should begin it. Politically, we try to apply pressure to Iran. I think it's inevitable we're going to have to move to stronger sanctions, and I think we should prepare for that. I think we should be preparing public opinion in Britain and in the rest of the European Union, which may be key in this particular role, to getting sanctions.
But preparing on sanctions in a way are a debate that does not involve the public. And people think they can live with sanctions. Sanctions on the Iranians don't affect us. But ultimately, if we're saying that Iran with nuclear weapons is that much of a threat, and the sanctions don't work, the implication is we have to do something about it.
Well, I think what the public need to understand is this, that while politicians in Britain may see Iran as a strategic problem, if you sit in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, it looks very much like an existential problem. When Ahmadinejad or Ali Khamenei talks about wiping Israel off the face of the map, there are people in Israel who remember the last time someone said that and they tried to do it. And it's a very different mindset, and we need to understand that. And just at the same time, you need to understand, anyone here who's been in Tehran will know that the mindset in Tehran is that anything that happens militarily from Israel would be pre-sanctioned by the United States and the UK, whether it is or not. So the idea of unilateral action by Israel not drawing in other countries, particularly the UK and the US, is a non-starter. This is a real tinderbox. We've got to go through this extraordinarily carefully, diplomatically and economically.
Liberal Democrats, this position on nuclear weapons, importance of Trident for the future in this very uncertain world, a world where, as Leo and Bob were both pointing out, Iran potentially is a huge threat. Surely we should be investing as much as we can to maintain a truly credible nuclear deterrent.
Well, there are, as you said in your introduction, both encouraging and very worrying things going on at the same time. Certainly the progress being made between President Obama and the Russians, I think, is a real cause for encouragement, but it's quite right, as we've heard, that the risk of Iranian or, as you said, North Korean arming themselves in nuclear terms would spark regional consequences in either or both cases, which would make the world a great deal more dangerous place to live. And what I think we should avoid doing now is jumping either to an overly optimistic or an overly pessimistic view of what the future might hold. We have got a nuclear deterrent at the moment, which will serve us for the best part of another 20 years. I believe it is premature to decide now that, come what may, in those 20 years, we will want to continue to be a nuclear power for a further 30 years beyond that. Equally, I don't favour taking any decisions at the moment that would close off the ability of a British government at that time to sustain a nuclear deterrent if they wanted to. Now, if you believe that the only way that you can possibly have a nuclear deterrent is by replacing the existing deterrent on a like-for-like basis, then you will fairly soon find yourself persuaded to the notion that decisions have to be made now and contracts have to be signed immediately. But if you will allow yourself even just the vaguest scintilla of doubt, or will entertain the possibility that you could sustain beyond 2030 a nuclear deterrent that was in any way, shape or form different, then you would be sitting down now and looking at ways of keeping that option open for the future, but without committing ourselves here and now to £104.2 billion worth of expenditure in today's money and taking a stance that, irrespective of what happens in the world, we are going to be a nuclear power until 2060, which I don't think...
What does that mean? What does that mean?
104 billion, 20 billion. Bob, yeah.
What Nick's effectively saying is let's unilaterally nuclear disarm. But
I'm not saying that at all. The audience has heard what I've said, and nobody has heard me say that. That is not what I said. This is complete nonsense.
The contracts do need to be signed pretty soon. We didn't bring forward the white paper in 2006 for the good of our health. If we had not done that, then we would have no submarine platform. And all of the alternatives were laid out in that paper for people to, make credible suggestions, if they could. And I have to say to you that other than, a basically CND argument, we got no alternatives put forward for a lot of effort made by the then Defence Secretary and a lot of other people to engage people in a conversation at that time. Just one thing I would say, just to prick Liam a little bit, because you tried to, Robin, but he didn't respond when you said stretching out Trident might be a contribution towards counter-proliferation. I'm not against stretching out Trident in terms of the decision-making if it's practical, but frankly it isn't practical. And to suggest that that we are able to extend the life of our current submarines in the way that's been suggested is not something that we're going to be able to do.
Well, I think we would agree here, certainly Bob and I would agree, is that we've got to have a continuous at-sea, minimum credible nuclear deterrent for the United Kingdom. If you don't believe that, then you have to say, if you believe in a nuclear deterrent, what sort of deterrent you want to have.
There are other ways you could provide a nuclear deterrent. I mean, obviously, one of the ways you could do it would be with a medium-range missile coming from a tactical submarine. Now, I know that those who are absolutely committed to replacing Trident on a like-for-like basis are absolutely, completely, with great zeal, convinced that this is the only way to do it. But it is not, as Bob just tried to have you believe, it's only CND types who entertain these ideas. Lord Guthrie, Sir Richard Dannett are not CND types, and there is an intelligent body of opinion throughout the military world who agree that you do not have to do this in that one particular way, that there are other intelligent alternatives that you could look at, and to conduct a strategic defence review, defence review, and omit from it the single most significant strategic decision that we're going to make and the single largest financial procurement that we're going to make in the next few years makes a complete mockery of the whole exercise.
But the alternative that's just been talked about is, in order to be credible, the numbers will be very, very significant because of the vulnerability of the type of weapon that is being talked about. And so it is, it is not a credible alternative.
Okay.
And yes, of course, there may be other people.
There
may be other people that put
they have other weapons as well. So not a credible alternative. But let's just stop here a second, because I think at the heart of this partly is the issue of money. And how do we work out which is the most important thing to spend at? And this is a moment, especially as the discussion is heating up now. I think I've warmed it up for you, Sarah. I'm going to head it over to you and let you carry on from here.
That's Robin. Robin's right. One of those ones, I know that position where you're thinking, oh, they've just raised that. Look, there's lots of questions thrown up there, and we're going to have plenty of chances to go through some of those, because I'm going to come out for questions. What I'd ask of you, though, we are absolute out 8:30. So we're going to try and bounce through a lot of arguments. I'm going to try and do it slightly with chapters. We're going to start with funding, which is what Robin talked about, and we'll get on to things like Afghanistan and nuclear. Obviously, those things will come up in funding, but let's try and talk about finances, because I don't know which one of you said you pay your money, you make your choices. All of you talked about adaptability, flexibility, and whatever was required. We know from the budget last week, the day after the IFS came out, saying, look, if you, and all your parties are talking about ring-fencing health, ring-fencing education, overseas aid, nobody's talking about ring-fencing defence. The IFS says 25% cuts elsewhere. I am sure you are going to say that that is not necessary. But if it's 10, if it's 15, whatever it is, something is going to have to go. Bob Ainsworth, what goes?
Well, we've got to, we've yet, you can't start off by just accepting that scenario, right? I mean, first of all...
OK, what do you accept? Look, we all know, we all know they're going to have to be...
We have to conduct a strategic defence review. We, unlike Liam, have said that the budget will remain protected for next year and it will increase.
You missed the news today. I think you missed the news today.
Right, you've just...
You used the word protected
You've just made another spending commitment.
What I want you both to say...
I think the Shadow Chancellor did this morning. Clearly your news system is not working very well today.
I'm going to go out to questions in a minute. What I want you both to say before we do is what you are, because you talk about protecting. Protecting, don't tell me what you're going to protect. Tell me what goes.
Well, I can't do that until we get... I mean, look, a strategic defence review has got to be conducted, in a proper manner. We've done the Green Paper. We've done as much as we can in order to throw these issues, to analyse them and to throw them into the public domain. And capability comes at the end and not at the start. We've got to look at our security. We've got to look at what we're prepared to pay. Yes, in a difficult financial situation. And
you are Defence Secretary.
From that debate,
after Labour are re-elected, the Chancellor comes to you and says, "What can you offer me?" What do you say?
Well, I will say to him that we will conduct a strategic defence review. We will look at we will look at our defence needs. We will have that debate with you. We will set our priorities, and at the end of that process. The capabilities that we need will flow from that decision making, and that's the decision making process that we want to involve the country in, and we've tried to do through the Green Paper process.
And the emergency budget in a future Tory government, if there is one, when George Osborne comes to you and says, "What can you give me?" What will you tell him?
Well, we've said today that in the budget, if we win next month, the first budget, there will be no change in the defence budget at all for the first year. To allow us to get into...
That means a freeze?
Yes.
A real terms cut, effectively a cut as a result of inflation?
Keeping the budget as set out in the government's current spending plans.
So for the next year?
For the next year.
Matching our commitment.
That's exactly what he said.
That would make you happy.
OK, so...
it's removed one of your weapons, but it would make you happy for a short term.
What can he promise will happen in 2011?
Well, what then happens is, now, we've kind of got to the beginning of this debate. We do have to have a proper debate on the defence review. But he's having a defence review.
You know the subject. What will you say immediately? Staff in the MOD. Quarter of the staff will go?
Question or answer? It's just like the Today programme, isn't it? Never get a chance to answer.
I'm looking forward to you answering.
Well, thank you. You'll get it eventually if you keep quiet. The defence review needs to be set out, as Bob says, in a logical fashion. You begin with, what are our national interests? What do you think the threats are to our national interests? Then what military capabilities do we require? Then you look at equipment programmes. Now, then you get an idea of what you need. And then you can work out the financial envelope. Now
I might be being very rude here, but I am going to push you because we're limited on time, and everybody knows that.
Because the bottom line is we've got a number of equipment programmes in the pipeline. The reports we have say they're unaffordable, but they're unaffordable if we keep doing what we're doing just now and try to do new things for the future. And the whole point of the defence review is to look at the future threats. What do we need to do in the future? And as the point we're making about Cold War legacies, what do we not have to do anymore that we're currently doing? That's, I think, where the big decisions inside the SDR are going to come. If you look at what McKinsey said...
Is there any difference between Labour and Conservative on what you are prepared to say about...
Well, we don't know what's going to come out of the defence review.
OK, fine. I mean, if that's the answer, that's the answer. Nick Harvey.
There's no point conducting a strategic defence review, which is a piece of work that's going to last a year or so, if we're going to decide in advance of beginning it what you're going to cut out.
I just thought that you three were quite well placed with your input to the defence review to kind of guide us as to what your contribution would be. Look, I know this.
You can't prejudge it in that way. The Ministry of Defence has got the best part of a 10 billion black hole in its annual budget at the moment. It's going to be the devil's job to get that in balance before the Chancellor, whoever it might be, comes knocking at the door asking for help with the budget.
If we try to do all the same things.
Let me get out the question, because I'm having absolutely no luck here, as you can hear. Let's get some microphones over there. I'll take them one at a time. If you wouldn't mind saying who you are, then asking your question. Gentleman over there first, then I'll come to whoever had their hand up in the middle.
Sorry, I'm Toby Fennick from Chatham House. I'm intrigued by this question. Are all three ministers in waiting actually seriously suggesting that they will not have an envelope from the Chancellor within which to do the SDR, and that it's all going to be driven exclusively by policy tools, and the Chancellor will pay whatever answer you come up with?
No, it's naive to think that resources isn't going to be a very big part of this, but it is equally, it would be pretty damning if it's the only part of the process. Now, you know, we did the Green Paper in order to start a debate, which I think we have successfully started. There's a lot of people who've joined in. Chatham House have joined in. Russi have joined in. A lot of other people, large sections of the press, in order to get that debate. And that cannot be totally and absolutely dominated by the financial resources. Of course it's part of it. You know, but our security needs, future threats, all of this have got to be part of the thinking that goes into the Strategic Defence Review.
But there are two ways in which we've carried out defence reviews since the war. Either begin with a foreign policy baseline, the one we've sort of set out this evening, and then you end up, of course, with a real debate with the Treasury about how much of this can I afford, or you begin with the money and say, what can I buy for it,
this,
in which case you will end up unavoidably with foreign policy implications you didn't set out to have. One is more honest, in my view, than the other, but it's also more painful.
If we start off with the envelope, it will be a salami-slicing exercise. It will not be a strategic review. The financial argy-bargy, as Liam quite rightly says, comes at the end.
OK. Gentleman there with his hand up in the middle, and then the gentleman at the front. If you wait for the microphone.
Ben Warwick from the British Army. I like what you say about threat-based strategic defence review, but we're all worried that you're going to let the political concerns of inter-service rivalry get in the way of true strategic threat-based thought when you come to your strategic defence reviews. Can you allay those fears?
Can you hold the microphone, because I'd like to come back to you on that one.
Yes.
We certainly... Liam Fox, expand, please.
Because I think it's partly how you conduct the review. It's about the process to make sure that it is properly politically driven. I think it includes the personnel that you set on the review. It also is the writing instructions that the review has. If you set them out very clearly with a very clear foreign policy baseline, I think you can control the process. And I don't think that these are necessarily the biggest problems we will face, incidentally. I think there is a bigger problem in terms of shaping how much we spend on future threats, on cyberspace, on space, for example, which do not involve that particular rivalry. In many ways, deciding how many JSFs you have is an easier decision than how much you decide to invest in some of these new threats. And that's going to be, I think, the very difficult part of the review itself.
I think the biggest worry will not be what you've said in terms of inter-service rivalry dominating this process. The biggest worry will be we have to avoid what was talked about over here, and there is salami slicing. Because I don't think that there are large parts of defence that will stand just salami slicing. We need a proper strategic look at what we continue to provide, what we can not provide, what we need to provide for new threats, and if we're not prepared to do that, we will fail our country at this time.
Before I come to
and I think that, grasping that is the biggest single challenge
What
in
are your
a strategic
fears?
defence
Can I ask the questioner his fears?
I have a concern that we are also going to be constrained in our STR by political worries about industrial base and about the public's perception of the future of our services and not the threat to our nation. I like what you're saying, sirs. I just hope you're right.
The gentleman at the front here.
Yes, thank you. Paul Judge, Chairman of the North American Advisory Council at Chatham House. My son's in the Army, and I know we have very proud services. But just speaking about inter-service rivalry, can you see that in 5 years' time we would just have combined the three forces into one? And what do you think the advantages and disadvantages might be?
Okay, Nick, do you want to start on this?
Well, I know people suggest this from time to time, and they say the three forces put together are smaller than the US Marine Corps in numbers. But I think that an incredible amount of time, energy, resource, and emotion would be wasted trying to drive them together, and it would be devastating in its impact to ignore the cultural and sort of operational differences. But there is an imperative to get the three forces working together as effectively as we possibly can. And I think quite a lot of progress has actually been made recently in that regard, and that they're working together.
But isn't that only because it got so bad, Bob Ainsworth?
No, and it's going to continue in some way or other, but I mean, the ethos that we get from the three services is something that we would throw away, yes, I think, at our peril. And we would lose an awful lot if we did that.
Do you think we lost something with the changes in the regiments?
Well, I don't think so. And I think that some of the new regiments will develop the same kind of history, over a period of time. And some of the heroism that we're seeing in Afghanistan will lay, the basis of, a great pride in some of the newly formed regiments. But that isn't to say that the inter-service bar will stay exactly where it is now, because it hasn't over time, and it won't be sensible to keep it there. We now do, the Joint Helicopter Force is the best example of where we've had to do things in a tri-service basis, and we've gained greatly from doing that.
So could the answer be yes?
No, I don't think it can be yes. I think we're going to have those three services. We're going to have to continue to get the huge gains in terms of ethos and buy-in that we get from our young people from those three services. But there are some aspects of what we do that it will be sensible to bring together, as we have done in helicopters, and we ought to be open-minded about that.
Well, the answer must be unequivocally no. And I think that you interfere with the emotional links that people have and the things that motivate our armed forces at your peril. And if you think it's a very good idea to amalgamate, go and ask a Canadian.
Okay. The gentleman right at the back with the dark hair, and then the gentleman right at the front, if you can get the microphone here after that.
Jack Ranger, Ministry of Defence. All three of you seem to be in agreement that it is almost impossible to recognise and to see the threats coming before they arrive. Given that statement, do we need to increase the amount of investment that we place in the collection and the analysis of intelligence?
Oh, very nice question. Liam Fox.
I remember when I was, I'm not sure if I should say this, but I remember when I was a junior minister in the Foreign Office back in 1996, I remember writing a memo at the time saying, if we degrade our ability to gather and interpret human intelligence, humans at the current rate, will be unable before very long to deal with, in a cultural and political context, with information that comes in. And now we can read every number plate and every car in Iran by satellite, but we don't really know who to talk to. And I don't really call that in advance. And I think that we do need to recognise that in an asymmetric threat environment, where you've got increasing levels of hybridity in terms of how you might face threats, intelligence is key. It is absolutely key, whether that's in international security or domestic security. And yes, we have to give that as much priority as we do other parts of our defence and security framework.
We're up against the funding problem again, though, aren't we?
It's a choice within it. You have to see defence and security increasingly as part of the same continuum. It's not a choice between security and defence. They are increasingly one and the same. And we need to make better use, bring our intelligence services closer together to get better value for what we spend in intelligence. But it is absolutely key. And anybody who thinks that you can have any amount of hardware and it will improve your security without having sufficient intelligence is making a probably fatal flaw.
More spent on intelligence, Bob Ainsworth?
Well, I mean, ideally, yes, but more spent on a lot of areas, ideally, yes. The key to getting maximum value for money is to join up your effort across government and to do that as well as you can. Now, we've done that, and we've tried to do that through the National Security Strategy. We've got to make sure that our agencies, that GCHQ, that Defence Intelligence are all working together. And we must be mindful as well that we cannot do this or all of it on our own. That we have a close relationship with the United States of America for one. That is very, very important to us, and that we gain greatly from. It's not a case of, I heard somebody say the special relationship is some kind of romantic notion that we ought to walk away from. I've got no romantic notions about the special relationship, but in a hard-headed world in which we live, our relationship with America is very, very important to us, and it will continue to be so.
Okay, Nick.
Intelligence is something the British are traditionally very good at. Diplomacy is something we're traditionally very good at. And I think that both are areas that we ought to beef up. Yes, it costs money. There's an opportunity cost to everything. But actually, both intelligence work and additional diplomatic effort are quite cheap by comparison to heavy chunks of metal. And I think if we are deciding where priorities should be in the course of this strategic defence review, they're both things that deserve a considerable boost. And I abhor cuts in the work of the Foreign Office.
Did the questioner want to come back on that? No. Gentleman at the front, please.
John Wilson, member of Chatham House. Speaking here the other week, Mr. Miliband stressed the need for security as one of the first and most important parts of future British foreign policy. In 1982, we spent 5.19% of our GDP on defence. Now I believe we're spending between 2.3 and 2.6%. Why, therefore, are we countenancing cuts in the defence budget? Why do we not make a political decision and show leadership and state that cuts, if they must be made to the economy, should be made elsewhere, and that the national defence must be paramount?
Okay. What happens when you make this argument, Bob Ainsworth?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's say that we spend more than most other countries in terms of the proportion of our gross domestic product. And as well, in real terms, we have one of the most capable armed forces in the world. So let's not walk away, from those two facts. And we have to live in the world, as it exists, and we have to compete with other people, and so we can't allow a total disproportionality to grow out of that. But I would say to you, as I've said to many other audiences, that we have to win those arguments in the wider public debate.
Is 2.3% about right, in your view?
Well, I mean, as Defence Secretary, I would like, the freedom to be able to spend a lot more, but I know the pressures that I get from my constituents, that others get from their constituents, and the pressures that there are on the public finances, and I'm not naive about that.
But what do you think would be, I mean, the fact that it was we've got the exact figures, 5.19%, thank you very much, and now is 2.3%. Well, yes, there are other areas competing, but the pie has been getting bigger. Why has defence got smaller relatively?
Well, there has been real terms increases in defence spending over the life of this government, and that's not counting the additional money that we've had for current operations in Afghanistan. Real terms increases over time of almost, increases of almost £1 billion, and a real terms increase of over 10%.
Liam Fox.
Well, first of all, on the figure of 5.1% in the middle, we were, of course, in the middle of the Cold War.
So what is appropriate for today?
Well, I don't think you can just pluck a figure out of the air. You also have to be careful with GDP figures, because GDP spend on defence will probably go up this year because the GDP is going down because of the recession, so that's a dangerous game to get into. Tony Blair said at the end of his premiership in one of his many farewell performances that Labour had kept defence spending constant at around 2.5% of GDP if you included what we spent on Iraq and Afghanistan, which said to me we were fighting 2 wars on a peacetime budget. I think it's dangerous to simply stick to that figure. inevitably there is a clash. And inevitably there's a clash when things get tight. And that's up for those of us who believe in that defence is the number one priority to fight our corner. And there will have to be a fight when we get to the end of the defence review. None of us, I think, are naive enough to believe that we can avoid that. There is also how we use that money. Now, McKinsey, a few weeks ago, produced some very interesting figures that showed that compared to other countries like us, that we were spending more money on administration than benchmark countries, more money on maintenance than benchmark countries, and less on new equipment. There are big debates to be gone down into how we use the money, as well as a very relevant argument about how much money we actually spend.
Did you buy into all of McKinsey said? If we can just get...
Did I buy into it? No, I didn't buy into all of them, but I thought there was at least the basis for a very interesting debate about how we spend our money in this country compared to others.
Too much on administration. Bob Ainsworth.
Well, I'd look very carefully at the McKinsey report if I were you, Liam, because they use the benchmark on maintenance of deployable forces as Greece, I believe. I don't know how you do that and come up with anything that's very worthwhile.
I don't think that's all we use, to be fair.
Well, there are a lot of errors in there. I mean, science spending is included in administration. I mean, this is not a very credible piece of work.
You don't think we're spending too much on administration?
Well, I think that we ought to bear down on administration. I do, but I think the notion that the notion that you can walk into the Ministry of Defence and get rid of a load of civilians without having to replace some of them with uniformed people, which will actually cost you more, is something that we ought to be very careful about, because we've tried to relieve our armed forces of those unnecessary burdens by civilianising some of the tasks. So there's some nice easy shots to be had, here that won't add up when it comes to actually putting them into force.
Okay, Nick Harvey.
This is
the original question.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this isn't the first time that Liam and I have shadowed each other. When we were running into the 2001 general election, we were both covering health. At that time, the National Health Service spent about 40 billion a year. Today, it's about 110, something of that sort. Now, the fact of the matter is that during the explosion in spending that took place from 2001 onwards, defence did not get its share, despite the fact that we went into Afghanistan and then into Iraq. But unfortunately, we can't rerun history. Those boom years are gone, and what we're facing now is a series of very lean years. The questioner says, why are we countenancing defence cuts? I don't think any of the three of us have said that we are countenancing defence cuts, but what we are all recognising is at the end of this strategic defence review, when these hard debates have been had, we are going to have to fight like dogs to get the resources that will be needed. And I think on a cross-party basis we'll have to help each other on that.
Do you not accept that you will have to countenance defence cuts?
No.
And you would all say no?
Well, you have to fight them very hard.
Yeah.
We are living in a period where the debt, people need to understand the economic context of the election.
Right.
It took us 2006 years to run up the first 450 billion of public debt. It's taken us 4 years to run up the second 450 billion of public debt. This is not a happy economic environment.
Yes, well. Right, now look, there's 15 minutes left. I did ask for just finance questions, but we've covered a whole host of things. Please, any questions, Afghanistan, whatever else. The lady here, first of all.
Deborah Haynes from The Times. President Obama has said that US troops will start to draw down from Afghanistan in the middle of next year. Are either of you three gentlemen willing to say when British forces will also start to draw down, particularly given the strain on other parts of the military that this focus on the Afghanistan effort is having on morale, etc., training?
Okay.
Yes, we should start to withdraw our troops when they have completed their mission.
Which is when?
And that's when they have completed their mission.
But the point about the question is President Obama is able to say this will start
President Obama
then.
has made his decision. We should withdraw British troops when we have reached the position that we set out to achieve of degrading the threats to Afghanistan and Pakistan to a level that they could be managed by their own security forces. I don't think it will be that sort of timescale. I think General McChrystal, talking about 4 to 5 years, is a far more realistic timescale to be seeing British troops coming home in a combat role. I think they'll be there in a supporting role.
Okay.
But he said that in the context of a decision that he was taking at the time to massively increase the troop numbers in Afghanistan. So he was putting an additional 30,000 troops into Afghanistan, and he was saying he would like to see some of those beginning to draw down in 2011. And that's the beginning of the process. Now, the process has got to be conditions-based, and to try to set some artificial timetable on it will not do our troops any good, and it will not do the Afghan government any good either.
Okay, the Liberal Democrats have always been much more lukewarm about Afghanistan, and perhaps a little...
Depends who you ask.
No, we haven't. We have supported the Afghanistan operation from the beginning. We were hostile to Iraq, but we were not.
I know, but even with Afghanistan, one sensed from Nick Clegg a slight moment of, not entirely comfortable with this.
Yeah, last summer we became very anxious indeed that the government was not giving practical effect to, and the Americans were not giving practical effect to what they had been talking about earlier in the year.
And that was Paddy Ashton's comment, but I'm also talking about Nick Clegg as well.
No, I'm talking about Nick Clegg, of embracing a political agenda alongside the military one. I'm very pleased to note progress on both sides of the Atlantic on that, and we are very much more comfortable with what is now happening.
The key point to Deborah Haynes' question...
The key point in Obama's announcement was the word beginning to, and I think with an eye on an election the following...
So you wouldn't...
I don't think we'll see a significant drawdown of British troops in the course of the next Parliament.
Can I just... A follow-on question that sort of reminds me of is this suggestion that General McChrystal may ask the British to move out of Helmand and perhaps stay within Kandahar. How, if that request was made, how would the British respond?
Look, there's a lot of thinking and a lot of talking going on in military circles about how best we cover the ground in Afghanistan. And there have been some changes as a result of that. Only today, I think, we actually finalised the decision to pull out of Musa Qala and hand Musa Qala over to the American side of the operation. Now, further adjustments to the line between our forces and the American forces in order to try to make sure that there's balance in force density are a very real possibility. If we were to contemplate, though, moving from Helmand to some other part of the country, I think that would. I don't think we should say absolutely categorically no, but I think we'd take some persuading as to that. I mean, we've been there since 2006. We've developed a deep understanding of the territory and the people who live there, and why would we want to throw that away, as well as all of the investment in facilities that we've made over a period of time.
Okay, you're not even. The gentleman there, please. And then I'll go to the gentleman who's got the microphone there.
Well, gentlemen, my question is addressed to three of you, actually. There's a very interesting story in India which occurred during when British were ruling that part of the world. And World War II was going on at that time. There was an old lady, very simple, illiterate, didn't know what the war was and who was fighting whom. She only knew that she had a son who she knew was very foolhardy, very arrogant, and very tough man, who was recruited by British, and he was sent to Europe to fight against Germany for Hitler. And the lady only knew that it was only his son who is wrestling with Hitler, who is equally foolhardy, arrogant, and very tough man. And she said, I'm worried, what will happen to this war? What will happen to this wrestling match which is going on between my son and Hitler? Now, I wish to say that those Afghan people, they are equally arrogant people, proud people, and sometimes very foolhardy, like we Anglo-Saxons are. We are also very proud, very arrogant sometimes, and sometimes very foolhardy. So I am worried what will happen to this. You said we will retreat from there when our mission is completed. Well, people are confused. Why we went there? What is our mission? How it is going to be completed? How you can kill all those Afghan people who are prepared to fight till the last man, and how America and British can retreat from there without facing humiliation. Can't we sit down and find some way out of it?
Okay.
You never allow us that long without interruption.
Okay, and I'm going to try. Perhaps the question can best be posed in this way: what is the way that we eventually get out? I hope I'm paraphrasing correctly in a sense. How will we get out in the
Getting Afghanistan to a position where they're able to defend their own people, and we are not about killing.
And where the Taliban
we're not
is part
about
of the government.
Killing all of the Taliban. We're about winning the people over, about protecting the people, and that is how we will succeed in Afghanistan.
And you have no doubts, Liam Fox.
We have to be very clear why we're there. We're there for reasons of our national security.
And
we cannot afford.
In deep, dark moments of the night, you don't think. You don't have doubts about it and wonder whether the...
No, I think that it's correct that we do not allow Afghanistan once again to be used as a base on which terrorism can be launched, nor can we even contemplate the potential collapse of Pakistan, which is the geopolitical threat that is actually there. And we are about degrading the threats so that the Afghan and the Pakistan authorities can deal with it themselves without reference to us. That is a strategy of containment. It's about degradation of the threat. It's not about building some Jeffersonian democracy in Afghanistan in a decade. We've got to be realistic about the timescales, realistic about our objectives, and then we'll have an idea of when we've been successful.
You were slightly irritated that I suggested you were...
We are not
doubtful
there,
earlier.
We're not there to create a Western democracy. It took centuries to create ours, imperfect though it is. We're there to help the Afghans build something strong enough that it won't fall over when we leave. I don't believe we'll leave in humiliation, but it's not the purpose to inflict humiliation either.
OK, the gentleman there, and then the gentleman at the front.
Peter Marsden from Free Me, a charity working in Iraq. Liam Fox talked about the Cold War being a battle of ideology. And the West, he said, won that because of their ideological commitment. But of course we know that the Cold War also spawned a welter of proxy wars, and much of the developing world is still recovering, has yet to recover from those proxy wars. What do the panel think are the ideologies at present that present such a threat that it might be worth tearing the world asunder again? And how do they avoid sending out the signal that the new enemy is those who take their Islamic faith seriously?
OK, who's going to start? Nick, do you want to start on that?
Well, we have to be extremely careful, in my view, with how we approach this and the way, the language we use and the way we put these things. I do not personally...
Haven't we learnt now? Are we not careful enough now?
I don't know. I mean, I don't sense that I'm locked in an ideological warfare with Islam. There are certain people in parts of the world who I think entirely corrupt the Islamic principles in order to pursue their own political agenda. And we've just got to be extremely careful, I think, about talking up the rhetoric of ideological conflict, because if we don't watch it, we will drive millions of good middle-of-the-road Islamic people into feeling that they belong in some sort of a camp to which we're opposed. So we embrace this sort of analysis, I think, at our peril.
I think that part of the danger, if I may say, is in the loose language that our questioner used. Maybe it was just to promote debate. But we are not dealing with the threat of people who take their Islamic religion seriously. The threat is a violent, anti-Western, politically motivated, heretical version of Islam, which actually bears very little resemblance to the religion itself. So let's not confuse one with the other. Our quarrel is not with people of any faith. Our quarrel is with people who would use it as an excuse to carry out violence against innocent people and murder them.
I spent 2 hours on Sunday afternoon, yesterday afternoon, in a very large gathering of Muslims in my constituency celebrating the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. And there is as much worry in the Muslim community about the way that their religion is misused. And that is, we have, a growing concern and a growing insistence that they will deal with this and that they will tackle it. And so it's not a clash between Islam and the rest, but, Islamist-based extremism is the biggest threat that we face at the moment. And if we deny that, we're denying reality.
Can I just pick you up on that point about a growing insistence that they deal with it? Are you talking about putting more pressure on the Islamic world itself to deal with the problem?
No, I'm talking about the Muslim community and the way that they increasingly recognise the way that some of the young people have been misused, and the way that their religion has been misused to distort the minds of some of their own young people.
And there is a growing awareness, I think, in the Islamic world about the threat that groups like Al-Qaeda pose to the stability of other Islamic countries. I've just come back from Saudi Arabia, and really they are now understanding the threat posed to their own stability and security.
Okay, gentleman in the front row has been waiting a long time.
Terence Parker, member of Chatham House. A very short question to do with morale.
With
like morale. I'd like to ask the three speakers whether they support the idea of generals and admirals going second class on the railways, and would they, out of solidarity, go second class themselves?
Should they go second class?
Well, look, I've got no problem with travelling second class on the railways. I have done regularly.
But should generals and admirals go second class?
And I don't see any reason, unless there are reasons otherwise, why generals shouldn't do the same, to be frank with you. I don't
Do you
think
travel
there is,
second class?
I don't at the moment, because I'm subject to a security regime.
But shouldn't they? Aren't they likely
imposed
to
upon
be?
me. But I have travelled second class. I did in my last job. I will. Well, I did when I was Minister for the Armed Forces, and most of my ministerial team, travel second class. So I've got no objection to travelling second class. And unlike Nick Winterton, I actually think you meet a better class of people in the back of the train than you do in the front.
Liam Foxton.
I think it's a sad day if you think that the way that you save money in your defence budget is to force people who've sacrificed their entire careers to get to the top of the armed forces to travel second class. I think it's just a very misplaced, politically correct thing to do, and I think most people think it's cheap and unnecessary.
I think it depends what they're doing and where they're going. If they've got a long journey and they're on business and they need to do some work, then they should be travelling first class. If they're making a short journey just to get from A to B, then there's no reason why they shouldn't go second class. Same as, frankly, anybody else travelling with public money.
Totally agree.
Ladies and gentlemen, huge apologies for those that I didn't. Lots of hands that I didn't get a chance to get around to, but I promised it's 8:30. There may be a chance afterwards anyway to have a chat. Let's thank Bob Ainsworth, Liam Fox, Nick Mellor.